Graphics are not the most important aspect of a Pokémon game, even if Twitter might sometimes make it feel like it is. Gameplay and fun are a lot more important. But that's not to say that the visuals don't matter. The way I look at it, there are a few different questions to ask about the visuals. Is it a good direction? Like, is it the kind of style that I want to see? Is it well done? Like, did they successfully accomplish what they were going for? This is related, but not exactly the same question as, is it high quality in a more technical sense? Are the textures good? The draw distance? The frame rates? And then there's the more all-encompassing question of, is it pretty? Most of these questions are very subjective. All of them are related, but they can have different answers. A game can be beautiful even if it's not the style that you would prefer. Or the style could be the right choice, but the textures are all too low resolution, so everything looks kind of blurry. These aspects work together, but they're individually important too. It's much easier to enjoy a game that has a fitting art style, that is competently accomplished, that is rendered smoothly, and that looks beautiful. I think I'll speak for myself. I was primed to pay attention to the visuals in Legends by the disappointment of Sword and Shield. I have a whole video about that, but in short, I think Sword and Shield have an uninspired art style. There are a few places that look gorgeous, but just as many that look terrible, and the graphic quality isn't great. So that was kind of my baseline when looking at Legends, and I want to evaluate it using those same angles. I'll go into the details, but I spent most of my time in Legends thinking that it looked fine. I like the art style for Legends a bit better than Sword and Shield. The humans and the Pokemon in particular look great. I love the flatter, cel-shaded rendering. I think it looks much more like Pokemon than what Sword and Shield did, although I do wish they still had outlines. The style of landscapes is not particularly inspired. I don't know why they have such strong highlights, and aside from the sky, it doesn't really have much character. Like, it's not very unique. But I do like the bluish or purplish hue that a lot of the shadows tend to have. Seems like a much more deliberate coloring choice than usual. And it kind of calls back to the art that Ken Sugimori did for Pokemon Blue, where he used some strong blues and purples for a bunch of the shading. And at least Legends is more consistent than Sword and Shield, whereas in Sword and Shield, standard trees and berry trees don't look like they belong in the same game. In Legends, they look the same, except one has fruit on it. I appreciate that. The execution overall is much more consistent too, and this is both a good thing and a bad thing. Sword and Shield was very uneven. It was clear that they paid more attention to some areas than others. In Legends, there is no place that looks outstandingly barren the way that the wild areas do. But this seems to come at the cost of there also not being any outstandingly beautiful areas because of all the extra care they paid to it, like the Slumbering Weald, for example. Every area of Hisui is consistently rendered, from Jubilife Village to the Cobalt Coastlands to the Alabaster Icelands to the Temple of Sinnoh. That is nice, but it also means that when they try to make a point of something being beautiful, it falls flat. The sunrise scene at the end of the Daybreak arc did nothing for me. At least Legends does seem to have new Pokemon models and definitely new attack animations, things that some portion of Pokemon fans had been complaining about. The Pokemon are generally a lot more active, which is pretty cool, although I do think it looks kind of silly sometimes when like a Luxray does a somersault to attack. I would guess that these models, and at least some of these attack animations, will get reused for Scarlet and Violet, but at least it shows that they did put a decent amount of effort in. Where Legends really doesn't meet expectations, though, is on the more technical side of things. The textures are very clearly repeating. You can tell this anytime that you can see a bigger swath of land, or especially if you can see light reflected on the water. Ouch. Draw distance for people and Pokemon is much better than in Sword and Shield, but there are still times when it feels too close, especially for large Pokemon like Steelix. Pokemon that are farther away are rendered at a lower frame rate, and it can be very obvious depending on the Pokemon. I think it's worst for the flying Pokemon. And the way that the landscape gets redrawn as you approach it is very jarring and even a bit confusing at times. But all of this, I assume, was part of a strategy to help the game run more smoothly. Keep in mind that this is a game where you can have dozens of Pokemon spawned in at once, each of them moving independently and with their own stat spreads and movesets. If you also factor in things like weather, this is probably a pretty memory-intensive game. I'm not a game programmer, but I would guess that the low poly and low frame rates for things in the distance were pretty necessary. It is also very jarring, especially early on, and it did take me out of the gameplay a couple of times. But honestly, I got used to it fairly quickly. None of this technical stuff had a huge impact on my enjoyment of the game. It is disappointing that the graphic quality doesn't match the gameplay quality, but the latter is definitely more important than the former. So, as I said, for most of my time playing Legends, I thought it looked fine. But that was most of my time. As many of you know, I pretty much did not look at any promotional material for Legends after the cover art and release date were revealed. I went in as unspoiled as possible. And I waited until I was almost completely done with the game before I went back and watched those other trailers and special features. Which means I was almost completely done with the game by the time I saw this vignette. Why doesn't the game look like that? That should have been the style of the game! Yes, I realize that it's just the same art style as the cover art, but the cover art has never reflected the actual art style of the game before, so I guess it just never occurred to me to imagine the game in that art style until I saw the vignette. And honestly, why don't the Pokemon games in general look like the art that they use to sell the games? It was more understandable back in the pixel art days. You can't exactly convey the aesthetics of watercolor in a grayscale 144p screen, but in 3D? On the Switch? Look at some of the beautiful promotional art that they have made for the games in the 3D era. Notice how, no matter which game they are for, across 2 different platforms in 3 different generations, whether the art is cinematic or just showing off a specific feature in the game, notice how consistent the art styles are. The shading, the line work. It's clear that they were not all done by the same person, and yet they all coalesce into a single, well-defined look. I'm ignoring Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl here because, if nothing else, they at least had the sensibility to give the promo art its own style. Game Freak and the Pokemon Company know this is the Pokemon art style. This is what Pokemon looks like. And yet not a single game has actually looked like this. I mean, I think the 3DS era games were going for it, at least in the overworld, and Oraz probably got about as close as it could given the resolution of a 3DS screen, but nothing on the Switch has tried this. You know, the system where the game could actually look like this? And I know it could because games like Baldo and Ni no Kuni have very close art styles to what we see in the Pokemon promotional art. Hell, even Little Town Hero, by Game Freak, looks like a better take on the Pokemon art style than any actual Pokemon game on the Switch.
Shots fired.
Good, that's the point. This is the most beautiful cover art of any main series Pokemon game by light years. This is what Pokemon looks like. The fact that this is not what the actual game looks like means that promotional vignette is a tease. And not like, here's a taste of what you'll get later, but here's a taste of what you will never have. And I'm trying very hard not to swear here because this sucks. I am very glad that I went in unspoiled and that I didn't see this vignette any sooner, because otherwise I might have spent most of my time playing the game wishing that it looked different, and then I would have enjoyed it a lot less. I said I was gonna try not to go on a rant, and I think I failed. But that's okay, that was necessary, I needed to get that off my chest. How did it go for you? Did anything about the visuals of Legends jump out at you, good or bad? And if you did see this vignette before playing the game, did it affect your enjoyment at all? Thank you to my patrons and YouTube channel members for supporting the work that I do here, especially luxury patron Ethan from Chicago, and thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next chapter.